Hey everybody, this is John Shutsky. I'm a professor and extension specialist with UW Extension. I'm in the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, and my area of expertise is agricultural health, safety, and I've done quite a bit of work on the whole issue of farm stress, including quite a bit of work here during the COVID pandemic in 2020. Um, this is actually a presentation that we will be doing later this week. It's the week of April 27th, and it's a presentation for agricultural service providers. I'm just going to do a quick, probably 15 to 20 minutes at the most. And please do view this as a teaser or kind of a sampler, if you will. There's obviously a lot more material, a lot more background we could go into. I do have a number of colleagues around the state of Wisconsin who have been trained, and we've gone through professional development, including with Michigan State in the area of communicating with agricultural professionals and obviously also directly with farmers. So I'm just going to provide you with a little bit of background, and I wanted to make this available at least to all the people in my organization, UW Extension, as we're also making it available to people in other agencies and organizations. So obviously, the whole farm stress issue is it's no big secret. We are working in an industry when we talk about farmers and agricultural producers, or in some parts of the country, ranchers, who are dealing with a number of stressors, the weather, the markets, the financial conditions. Financial conditions have not been good now for almost 3.5 or 4 years at least, depending on when you look at the prices and the market conditions and some of those kinds of things. A lot of uncertainty. We deal with weather, we deal with issues of family working together, and we're also now increasingly dealing with issues of workers and labor and finding good workers to work on farms. So all of these things together contribute to a lot of stress. We also know that farmers as a group have a high rate of injury, including fatal injuries, and so there are lots of different outcomes. Those outcomes include health outcomes. We know that stress affects the heart, the blood pressure. It can have an impact on people's health if they experience type 2 diabetes, which is not uncommon in our rural communities. And stress also leaves us more vulnerable to seasonal infections, the colds, the flus, those kinds of things that happen during particularly fall, winter, and early springtime. And I think really for this presentation, we also need to think about things like increased incidence of depression, anxiety, the impact on communications and relationships. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And again, I mentioned injury, which is a big issue with our farming community. And last but not least is suicide risk. We do know that farming as an occupation and as an industry group, based on recent data from the Centers for Disease Control, ranks as one of our top industries in terms of suicide rates and suicide risk. I just wanted to provide an additional note with the COVID outbreak, with the pandemic. We do know that the average farmer is above the age of 50. So we know that with COVID, we have people that are maybe at a little bit higher risk. And this is creating stress for many of our farmers and many of our farming families, particularly the older people. We also know that people who are obviously of advanced age, my age and older, I'm 59, so people get into their 60s and 70s, they experience additional health concerns. And right now it's a little bit difficult to get just normal routine health care. So that's another factor that we get concerned about. And then from a ag standpoint, from a rural community standpoint, accessing mental health and behavioral health care is really a big challenge just in terms of basic access. But then we also experience issues connected to stigma and people just not wanting to go out and get the help that they may or may not need. The last thing that I wanted to just mention on this slide is in our urban areas and suburban areas of Wisconsin, there's a lot more attention being paid to telemedicine and telehealth. And with our farming communities, that's possibly an option depending on the types of healthcare coverage that families have, but it is also potentially very limited with about 20% of our farming operations. We just published a study back in October of 2019 And in that study, we found that about 20% of our farming operations, in fact, don't have any type of high speed internet access, including access through a smartphone. So, I wanted to just talk a little bit about this whole notion of stress. Stress is not just in our head, it is actually caused by the real impacts of stress hormones that are there for a reason. They're there to help us change and survive. But they also, those stress hormones, if they are present over long periods of time, whether that's days or weeks or months or even years, chronic stress can develop. And with chronic stress, we know that these stress hormones, which are cortisol and adrenaline, they change the brain. They decrease the functioning of the parts of our brain that are responsible for smart decision making, for relationships, for maintaining good positive communications, whether that's with family members or other people who are involved in the ag industry, including ag service providers. But those impacts on the brain in many cases are not positive. And as a result of those impacts of cortisol and adrenaline and other stress hormones, we end up making bad decisions. This is just not at all uncommon. And those bad decisions, if they're financial decisions, or decisions about our families or decisions about our safety, we oftentimes see bad consequences to those bad decisions. And then that further just fuels, it continues to fuel the outpouring of these hormones. And so we find ourselves in this vicious cycle. And this is when we start to see people having issues connected to health. Again, relationships, communication, the increased incidence of anxiety, depression, and again, yes, possibly suicide as well. So it's really critical that we, as ag service providers and professionals, regardless of your role out in a community, is to help people understand that there are ways to throttle or to mitigate or modulate the stress response. I think of it as a throttle, like a throttle on a tractor, where you're looking for how do I kind of remove some of the fuel? How do I dampen this stress response so that we're not continuously pumping out all of these stress hormones? And it is difficult because our natural thermostats that are located in the brain, the receptors that control the stress response, simply become less effective. They don't function as effectively. And actually, for people that are dealing with long-term chronic stress over the course of several years, we actually see some shrinkage of the parts of the brain that are loaded with these receptors, these little thermostats that help to turn the stress response down. So it is important, again, to make sure that you know where some of these throttles, where some of these critical control points are located. It's really important to note, and I have it highlighted here, that number one, there's multiple throttles. But one of the things that is really critical is having the patience to work carefully with an individual or with a family to do what you can do to help them regain some sense of control. I'll come back to that just in a moment. But if there was one magic ticket or golden ticket to reducing or de-throttling the stress response, it is control. People who don't have any sense of control end up feeling helpless, and then those kinds of feelings really do serve to spiral a person in a negative direction. Let me just talk about some other things that are not less important, but you really do have to think proactively. One is the idea of activity and exercise. I get so much pushback from farmers, regardless if you're a dairy farmer or a crop farmer. I get a lot of pushback on this because people say, I'm a farmer, I get more than enough exercise and activity. But the fact is that other kinds of activity, as long as a person is healthy and as long as this is a kind of an approved activity by their primary health care professional, some type of non-work purposeful exercise and activity is really, really crucial. It helps oxygenate the brain. It helps actually to regrow the parts of the brain or the receptor areas of the brain that can actually, like I said, become less effective and can physically shrink in volume. There are now MRI studies that show the actual physical impact of physical activity, even with older people, in helping to rebuild some of those receptors to help mitigate or modulate the stress response. Food, nutrition, really critical. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we do find that all of us All of us, when we find ourselves in times of pressure, a lot of stress, a lot of things going on, we're worried, we're anxious, we're not sleeping well. Those are also times we don't eat well. And our body's like a machine. Our brain is a small organ. Our brain only weighs about 3 pounds, and yet our brain, as such a small part of our body, actually consumes about 25% of the total amount of energy that our body needs to live. And so it's really critical during these busy, stressful times to make sure we're eating well and maybe eating as a family or spending time eating together. Quiet time for purposeful reflection, again, simply spending 15 to 20 minutes a day, getting away from the farm, getting into an area where you can kind of just stop and be quiet and reflect. Ideally, it would be outside in nature. But these are really critical times. A lot of people find consolation, and they find this relief and this stress management benefit in prayer. So whatever it is that works for people, encouraging them that that's an investment in themselves. And then the last one is sleep. This is really easy to talk about, but it's difficult to practice. But right now, some of the real basic things are making sure that you follow, especially right now with COVID, with the pandemic, making sure you have a regular awake and sleep schedule. Make sure you go to bed at approximately the same time every night. Practicing good sleep hygiene, for lack of a better word. Putting the smartphone in a different room so that you're not tempted to wake up at 2 in the morning and check the markets or check the futures or whatever it is that you might look at, or text messages from workers or family or from neighbors. That's really, really critical. And then also making sure you watch caffeine. Caffeine's an enemy to sleep. A cup of coffee in the morning or a can of Mountain Dew before lunch, probably not a bad idea for the majority of people, but it can be really damaging in terms of sleep. And sleep is needed to help people manage this chronic stress response. Here's a little secret for you. I'm talking about you as an agricultural service provider helping farmers, helping producers, but this stuff applies to us as well as ag helpers, as people who are living and working in agricultural and rural communities. We need to practice these same things. It's stressful for us as well, whether we want to admit it or not. These are difficult times for everybody. And so all of these principles that I've been talking about apply regardless of the industry you're in. I talked a little bit about the importance of planning. I talked about control and helping people regain a sense of control. One of the things that I see so commonly is people say, I don't have time. I know, John, that you're advocating that I sit down on a Sunday afternoon and maybe spend an hour, a couple of hours, maybe doing some planning for the coming week or weeks. Doing a to-do list, doing some prioritization, communicating within my family, with my kids, maybe my main workers that are responsible for helping to manage and run the organization, but I don't have time. And what I find happening is people say, I don't have time to do that. Instead, what I want to do, we're going to make it through this. I'm going to put my nose down into the furrow or under the grindstone, and I'm just going to plow through this. And instead of working my normal 75 hours a week, I'm going to work 90 hours a week, and I'm going to work my way through that. And in some cases, if that work does not involve the physical act of doing some planning and prioritization, people are going to find themselves spinning their wheels at best. And at worst, they're going to find themselves sick or hurt or badly injured. And again, those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness only will serve to compound. When we talk about planning, it's really crucial to know that you are not having to do this by yourself. And again, during times of stress, because of these physical and chemical changes to the brain, the common tendency is to check out. I get really stressed. I don't want to talk to anybody. I'm going to bury myself in my work. But these are actually the times when we need to be thinking about connecting with other people, enlisting help, whether that's from experts, financial people, legal people, production experts, cooperative extension, local technical colleges, regulatory agencies, but doing lots of communication and lots of talking. I sit on the slide here, who else? I would also recommend strongly urging that people in our rural communities are getting appropriate health care from their primary, whether that's a family a practice physician or other person in the community, a nurse practitioner, or whoever it is that's providing their local clinical services. Because a lot of times it's hard to tease apart the stress response from normal health issues that we all deal with, and that can again become worse as a result of all the stress that we're facing in farming and agriculture. Communication is quite critical. We don't have lots of time, but a lot of these things kind of go hand in hand. By doing things that help us to take care of ourselves better, it becomes our brain becomes healthier. It becomes a little bit easier to communicate, but communication needs to happen in a purposeful way. I do have a fact sheet that I will link. This is actually a 2-page fact sheet called Helping Tame Farm Stress, Communication Strategies for Agricultural Professionals. In this publication, I have 10 pretty detailed strategies. I wanted to just maybe cover a couple of those here. Number 4, number 5. Number 4 is difficult for people. If you're a person who was not on that farm working, and you're working with somebody, you may find that they're really maybe don't have a strong sense of a grasp on reality of the situation, or they might be worried about things that you think are of lower priority. But it is really crucial to listen to people, to be patient. By listening to their immediate short-term needs, it will help them when you start looking at or moving towards those longer-term, higher priority needs. It will help to provide them with some clarity if they have a chance to work through some of those things that are at that point in time causing them the most difficulty. And what they're feeling right now today is real. So listening, when we talk about communication, there's one key, and that is the ability to listen, to ask questions, to be able to ask open questions, to be able to have some level of empathy, but to allow people to express themselves so that together you can work with them to arrive at a solution. Number 5 is to help others tap into and use the social support systems around them. I talked about the importance of reaching out, not going it alone, working with your technical people, your veterinarians and your consultants, your regulators and those kinds of people. But it's also important that people check in or continue to stay connected to their social support systems. Churches, schools, community elders and mentors in the community. I know that in many of our areas we have these older people who have been through the 70s and the 80s, and they've experienced and they have a sense of wisdom and are trusted. So making sure that people don't totally check out and check away from those kinds of community support systems. There is lots of good information out there. We in Extension here at Wisconsin have put together a very comprehensive website called Resilience Farms, Families, Businesses, and Communities. The link is indicated here on the site. We have this divided up into 4 sections. I won't go through all 4, but the lower right-hand quadrant called Your Farm Future not only covers the issues of farm stress, but it also talks about financial issues and the financial situation, including lots of tools helping farmers think through their current and maybe a future state or a future scenario if they are thinking about getting bigger, getting smaller, getting different, diversifying, or maybe focusing, or in the case of some of the farms that we're working with in Extension, helping them think about decisions which might be very difficult, transitioning, transferring assets, and even just totally getting out of farming entirely. I'm not advocating for that here in this presentation, but do know that those kinds of resources are out there and available. This is my last slide. A couple of other resources that I wanted to mention is the Wisconsin Farm Center, located in our Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection, 800-942-2474. They offer a range of financial and other types of services, and I've actually included them on this slide. Well, number 1, financial situation is quite important. But number 2 is they do provide vouchers, mental health vouchers for people who might need counseling and they might need some kind of help. And they do provide free services that are available through the state and again through the Wisconsin Farm Center. Harvest of Hope is a organization that provides financial support directly to farm families. I've already talked about extension. I included the Suicide Prevention Coalition of Iowa County. I would really encourage you to go to the Wisconsin Department of Health Services and search suicide prevention. There are every county has its own array or collection of resources, people, experts, organizations. The very last slide, or the very last bullet here, is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Let me just close the presentation here by saying it's really crucial that if you encounter somebody who you are concerned about from a suicide risk perspective, that you find a way to strongly encourage them to get some help. That can include calling 911 if somebody is immediately of risk to themselves. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is a really great resource. It's really too much to try to cover here in the 15 to 20 minutes that I have. So I would really encourage you to also get a little bit of extra training in professional development and suicide prevention. There's some great programs out there. Two that I'll just mention are QPR, and the other one is called Mental Health First Aid. So QPR, which stands for Question, Persuade, and Respond, or Refer. And then Mental Health First Aid is a longer program, but really could provide you with some excellent information that can save a life. So I hope that this is helpful information. Please feel free to reach out if you have any comments or questions. My email address will be linked as part of this presentation. And I hope you have a great day and stay safe.